Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you can see my slides. Welcome to my talk about data visualization and storytelling, or data storytelling through visualization. First, a little bit about me. My name is Marysia. I'm a data scientist and data science educator at Go Data Driven, a company in the Netherlands. And I'm also an organizer for the Amsterdam chapter of PyData. And besides that, I'm also a hobbyist storyteller, whether that's on stage or through writing. I love stories. And I used to think that this was a hobby that I had that was very different from my technical day to day programming job as a data scientist. But I learned that that may not be the case. And that's what brings me here to you today. Because data visualization, something that is very common in my day to day work, can also be a form of storytelling. Just to get a couple of details out of the way, I want to make some things clear. First of all, what this talk is not going to be about. It is not going to be about data visualization for data analysis, the type of data visualization you do to get insights from your data set before you do any modeling. You probably got that covered. It is also not going to be about what the best plotting library is in Python. In fact, all the figures and graphs I made for this presentation, I simply used basic matplotlib. And the things we'll be talking about today are about data visualization as a whole, not restricted to any tooling. But then, of course, you wonder, what will this talk be about? Well, first of all, I'm going to try to convince you why data visualizations can tell a story. And second of all, I'm going to show you some simple steps of how your visualization can tell the story that you want to tell. So let's start at the beginning. Why do we bother visualizing data to begin with? Some people are of the impression that charts are simply pretty pictures, while all the important information can be gathered through statistical analysis. An effective and often used tool to demonstrate that visualizing your data is in fact important are these four figures here. These are a data set, the Anscombe's quartet. It's a set of four data sets where each data set produces the exact same summary statistics. That means the mean, standard deviation, and correlation, which could lead one to believe that the data sets are quite similar. But it turns out that if you visualize them, they lead to very different visualizations, and these data sets are clearly not the same. So let's say that we have a data set, we have an X and a Y coordinates. We have some summary statistics because we have the values. But your question is, does that tell you everything about the data that you want to know? In this case, does it have any added benefit to also make a plot of the data? Well, in this case, it actually does, because we see that if we plot the X and Y coordinates, it represents a dinosaur. And this data set is a dinosaur. And this data set was created by Albert Kaido and urges you to never trust summary statistics alone. Always visualize your data. This point is even further emphasized in the article Same Stats, Different Graphs, where the authors created 13 distinct datasets with the same summary statistics. So that's the X and the Y mean, the X and the Y standard deviation, the Pearson's correlation, the 2 decimal places, whereas you can see that these are actually drastically different in appearance. So we know visualization matters. But you probably know that. You've probably also made some visualizations yourself. So the question is, what does that have to do with data storytelling? Well, first of all, there are different types of data visualizations. We have a visualization like this one, which is a simple scatter plot of 9 data points made with matplotlib. And this was made just like our dinosaur plot to get a little bit more insight into the data at hand. But that's a very different type of data visualization than the one that we see on the right here, where we have a data visualization that visualizes the number of deaths per month in Iraq from 2004 until 2011. But whereas one is a simple plot intended for data analysis, the other one, the one on the right, is clearly designed to incite some kind of emotion. The title, the color, the orientation of the bars, they all contribute to the message. You don't even have to see or read the exact numbers that it represents to know what this visualization is probably trying to tell you. And just as easily, that message can be flipped as well. The data visualized here on the right is identical to the one on the left, but because the data was presented in a different way, it also guides you to a very different conclusion. And that's why we typically make a distinction between two types of data visualization. The first chart we saw, the simple matplotlib scatter plot, is an example of exploratory data visualization. That's what we do when we, as individuals, are looking for insights hidden in our data. We form hypotheses, for instance, is the customer satisfaction going up over time? And we check these hypotheses by visualizing our data. And this is what we do when we're looking for whatever is noteworthy or interesting about our data, or hidden gems in the data, so to say. But the second type of data visualization is what we call explanatory data visualization. And this is the type of visualization that you make when you want to communicate the insight that you found by exploring your data with someone else, an audience, most likely not a data scientist. That doesn't immediately need to be a fancy infographic like the one we said before, but where exploratory data visualization is experimentation, explanatory data visualization is there to communicate an insight. And it also means that the best exploratory visualization is not necessarily the best explanatory visualization. Because when you're exploring your data, you have the luxury of time. You can look at summary statistics, create different visualizations, spend some time dissecting the information on the graph presented to you, and make connections to insights that you gathered before. But when you're communicating your insights, you do not have that luxury of time. If you're presenting to a stakeholder, you cannot take them through that whole process that led you to your insight. It should be as clear as possible from the get-go. So, exploratory visualizations tell a story. Maybe your analysis revealed that the recent changes to the marketing campaign made people look more favorably towards your company, and therefore you recommend continuing with this. Or you've discovered that chickens grow best on a certain diet, therefore you recommend this diet. There's often a point. Explanatory visualizations aren't just there to be pretty or to prove that you did some work as a data scientist. They are there to support a point that you're making or start a conversation. Because data is only valuable if given context. And while data itself might be objective, every decision you make on how to present it shapes a different story. Look at this chart, for example. It shows the population growth over time over the last 60 years. And we see that there's quite a bit of growth there. It looks a bit worrying. But this graph looks critical. Both line charts come from the exact same data set, but a tiny decision like the amount of years you display as a reference have a huge impact on the story the chart tells. And our role as a data storyteller is to bridge the gap between clinical and analytical data and the story that we want to tell from the data, the context of that data. So how can we tell a story with our data? Like I said, I'm a hobbyist storyteller, and when we think about stories, there are three main points, and it's not beginning, middle, or end. It is the context in which the story takes place, the people or the characters in there, and what their motivation or purpose is. And although our story of our data does not feature people or places, we can have similar elements in our data stories. And these are the three F's. First of all, the foundation of the visualization, the way you choose to display the data itself. The focus, what characteristics you can add to draw the attention where you want the focus of the reader to be. And forward, what should the takeaway of the visualization be? How do you want the reader to move forward after having seen this visualization? So that's what we will be talking about for the rest of this talk, starting with, of course, the foundation. First of all, there are a couple of different charts. So there are different plots, line plots, scatter plots, bar charts, pie charts. But they display different, and they can all display information, but maybe differently. So for example, if you look at these two graphs, Both show the exact same data, the total number of participants and the number of trainings offered during the year. But if you look at them, which one of them is better at showing the trend, how the numbers change during the year? Is that option A, the line chart, or option B, the bar chart? In this case, if you were interested in the trend, option A is actually better. It immediately communicates the insight that you want to give, the trend. Whereas for option B, you can still see the same things, but it takes a little bit more effort to get that out of the graph. And the same goes for this example. Let's say that we have these two graphs. Again, they display the exact same data source, but which one makes it easier to determine which investment has a greater share? In the first one, the blocks look roughly the same size, the blue and the orange block and the green and the red block. Whereas in the second option, option B, it seems pretty clear that international stock is the biggest share of investments here. And this would even be more visible if the background of the graph had been a grid. So how do you determine the right chart for your use case? First, a bit of experimentation helps. So have an insight in mind that you want to communicate, for instance, the trend, and create a couple of different charts and see which one conveys that a little bit better and which one works best. But there are definitely certain types of charts that simply work better for certain types of data, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself. So chartguide.com has, I think, an amazing poster that gives an overview of what charts work well for what data types. And this is only a fraction of it because the whole poster is too large to show, but I wholeheartedly recommend it. But even if you have the right chart, there are still a couple of things that I like to point out because it isn't just about picking the right chart. One of the things, for instance, is you also have to make sure that the reader or the people who you're presenting to is familiar with the type of chart that you have. For example, charts with error labels and confidence intervals are typically not your friends when it comes to explanatory data analysis. I get it, they're great. Explanatory data analysis, they give you good confidence intervals, for instance, help you understand your data a lot better, as they give a general idea of how precise a measurement is, but it won't help the reader understand the data. Or, for instance, a box plot, like look at these box plots over here. This chart tells us a lot in terms of attack score for each Pokemon, or each type of Pokemon. We don't just know the average, we also get a feeling for the consistency within the group. But as you can see, there's a lot going on here. And again, when you're exploring, you have the luxury of time to analyze this chart. The person who you're presenting to has to immediately understand the point that you're trying to make. And box plots aren't as common outside of exploratory data analysis as you might think. So before you show them a visualization like this one, you might have to show them this one, where you explain exactly what a box plot represents, how the interquartile range is calculated, how we calculate the minimum whisker and the maximum whisker. And I don't think that's going to make your stakeholder very happy. Second of all, something to keep in mind is choose the data to display carefully. So we saw that here with the population growth example, where the ranges that were chosen to display had a huge impact on the story. And although it might seem obvious, the limits and ranges can drastically change the story as well. For instance, these are, again, 3 graphs based on the exact same data set about booksellers. But because the limit in the first graph is different, it seems like there's a huge difference in sales between bookseller 1 and bookseller 2. Whereas in the second graph, where we change those limits and ranges, it seems a lot closer. And it also converges when you talk about units. In the third graph you see here, we converted the actual sales to the percentage of sales. And again, because we changed the units, these two bars look a lot closer to each other than, for instance, in the first or the second image. So the choices you make on how to display your data influence the conclusions people will draw from the graph as well. And I think this one is actually a very good example as well, where The creator of this image tried to discourage media from reporting election results, like in the first case with a pie chart that only represents the 5% of precincts that have actually reported the results. Whereas if you also report the unknown data, actually looks a lot different. It gives you a different impression. So by not choosing to display data or even lack of data, you can severely impact the story. And as data storytellers, unlike fiction storytellers, we have an obligation to stay close to the truth. So that being said, let's move on to our next topic, the focus. And for this one, I want to do a little exercise with you. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers, and I want you to, as quickly as you can, count the amount of fives that you see in the image. All right, there we go. All right, how was that? You probably could find a bunch of fives, but it took you a little time because you had to sift with your eyes through all the numbers. However, if we present this in a slightly different way, it's probably much easier to catch all the fives that are in this image. When there's a lot happening on the screen at once, everything is asking or demanding for your attention. And the use of color can help you guide your attention or draw your attention to the right thing. And that isn't limited to just color. Here we have a similar example with shapes. In this example, the 8s and the 1s appear in the exact same places, but it's probably easier to spot the 1s because they are more distinctly different. When we are creating data visualization for explanatory purposes, we have something specific in mind that we want to communicate. And if we use a visualization that we use to get that insight that we had time to analyze, that probably has too much clutter in there to focus the attention to what you want to communicate. Take this image, for example. This is an image of the goals scored by each country in the group stage of the 2020 European Championships. And all the data is there, but it can be a little bit unclear what I'm trying to show you. So this is an example where color might be helpful. In this case, for example, the red bar draws your attention. I probably want to say something about the goals of the Netherlands. But red isn't the best choice because it's associated with danger and negativity. So maybe we go for green instead. Which is more gentle and more positive. But because the bars are blue, it doesn't stand out as much. So an alternative would be to use a color that's more representative. Orange, for instance, which is the color associated with the Netherlands. And we can even actively draw the attention away from the other bars by giving them less noticeable colors and attract more attention to the bar that we're interested in, the high scoring number of the Netherlands. And we can even add to this visualization by giving our story a little bit more context. For instance, in this case, by adding a line and some text to the chart. In this case, the line indicates the maximum number of goals in the championship 4 years earlier. And by adding that line, we see that actually quite a few countries scored more goals than the top number of goals in the previous championship. And again, we can further highlight that again. And you see now that this visualization directs your attention to the high scoring countries and that the Netherlands is the highest scoring country. Whereas when you compare that with the original graph, that you don't really know what to focus on. So by changing the colors, adding some text, we have transformed the first graph, simply a lot of information, into a visualization that immediately and easily lets you draw some conclusions, such as the Netherlands was the top scorer and there were more high scoring teams than in the previous championship. There are, of course, more elements than just text, lines, and colors that you can add, but these are usually enough to get the point across. You don't want to add too much because then you might lose the audience. And also keep in mind that when you pick colors to use, the default colors in most visualization libraries are there because they're easy to read for the colorblind. So keep that in mind when you change the colors as well. Another element that really helps to draw the attention is the title. Let's look at this image, for example. It visualizes the results of a survey of students of class 3A who were asked whether they liked a subject or not. And this graph displays the percentage of students who like the subject. Because of the title, you'd probably be inclined to look at the first few subjects first. Whereas if we change the title slightly, your focus is drawn towards the negative and will likely go to the bottom. And you can combine this with previous techniques, of course, such as adding color or adding more context to the graph itself. And because of some simple design choices, your attention is guided to a completely different part of the data in these two graphs. The one on the left is focusing on how languages are popular, while the one on the right focuses on when some subjects are not very popular. And this brings me to my last point, forward. What is the takeaway from your visualization? Ask yourself that question. Ask yourself the question, what actions do you want people to take after seeing this visualization? How should their lives change because they saw your data? You're not just communicating it because it's nice to know. It's probably nice to know because you want to either convince people to do something or start a discussion. Because no, without an action, no matter how or discussion, no matter how amazing your chart is, people are likely going to forget it. This graph, for example, shares an interesting insight, but what's the person you're presenting to supposed to do with this insight? It's nice to know, but it doesn't change anything. So people will likely forget it. And the same goes for this graph. It's negative, it's not very nice, but what do I do with this? Why are we directing the focus to this negativity here? Well, one way to change that is by simply changing the title. If we change it to "We need to change the way we teach STEM subjects at our school," it is immediately clear why we're looking at this plot. And it's especially helpful to use active titles that start with "we need," "we must," "we should." Typically, what you'll want to do is this. You want to put your point first using an active title, then people know what they're going to look at. Then you want to present the visual data that supports this point. It helps guide the focus. And usually want about 3 elements that emphasize the focus on where it needs to be. So the title in this case already focuses towards the bottom. The red and the line, they all add to the focus. And lastly, you want to re-emphasize the action to take or start the discussion. This doesn't have to be text in your visualization itself. It can also be the story that you tell along with the graph, but it usually doesn't hurt to put it into words either. And with that, you've converted a simple insight to an actionable one that you can effectively communicate simply with having a good foundation, the good chart, directing the focus, and focusing on how people must move forward. Data storytelling is the art of successfully communicating about data, and hopefully my talk today has made that a tad bit easier for you. With a good chart as a foundation for your data, titles, colors, and text to help guide the focus, and lastly, a way to present how to move forward or start a discussion, a reason for showing this graph, that is a successful communication about data and much more successful than simply showing the insights, the exploratory data visualization that you got to, that you made to get your insight in the first place. That being said, thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for having me here today, and I hope to have inspired you to tell stories with and about your data. My name is Marysia Winkels, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything you want to share. You can find me on LinkedIn or just email me directly if you want. And if there are any more questions now, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Marysia Winkels. We have some questions here from Zenel Batagel, and I'm going to show that now so that you can see it. So the question is, they said this presentation is really cool. So
Yeah, so I
hopefully
see.
they want to ask if there will be links to all the things we are using.
Yeah, so one thing that I can recommend, and I got a lot of inspiration from,
Okay, thank you.
is a book called
So the
Storytelling with Data.
next, the,
Yeah, so I can really recommend a book called Storytelling with Data from Cole Nussbauer. And she has some really interesting talks online as well.
Telling a story
I also have a
shift
list of
from
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Marysia. I'll just jump in there. I think Abdul Hakim is facing issues with your questions. Please go on with the book description.
Yeah, so my biggest inspiration for this, and which really shifted my view, I was a data scientist and I always just thought I got the insight from this data visualization, so you should be able to get it too. And the person who really challenged that view and taught, and I learned about explanatory data visualization was from the book Data Storytelling with Visualization by Cole Nussbaumer, and she has some really cool talks on YouTube as well that I really recommend. And yeah, there's some great resources out there. I can put some links in the chat as well.
Oh, definitely. I think it would be good as well. Perhaps some on Discord, if you can pop in a
Yeah,
couple of
sure.
bullet points,
Yeah.
that would be quite useful. There is another question by Glenn Lehman. In fact, there is a whole series of discussion in chat because it sort of invites a lot of subjective debate about how you present your data. I will just bring it up here and we'll just have a quick comment about that. So Glenn Lehman is asking, when does telling a story shift from sharing information to selling a point of view?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I didn't put a lot of attention to like manipulating data and misleading data, but that's of course a choice that you can make to display your information or your data in such a way that it leads to a certain conclusion by omitting things or by intentionally misleading. That is something that you can do, but it's something that I very much discourage. Like I said, I think the difference between a data storyteller and a storyteller is that um, we are we should not write fiction. We should stay true to the facts. So while I think that techniques to guide focus and to make a point, and especially to start a discussion, can be really helpful because you have something that you want to communicate, I really strongly discourage like creating misleading charts and those kinds of stuff. It's a tough balance. You want to
Yeah.
share information in the most effective way possible, for instance, by guiding the focus, but you don't want to sell a point of view. I mean, maybe you do, but let's not do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. All right, I'm going to continue to go through the very long list of questions potentially. Yes, there we have a question.
Yeah. So what tool do you use to tweak the charts? So because I recently got in this idea of creating more beautiful visualizations, I would really like to be able to make more beautiful visualizations, especially because if you're telling a story, if it helps that if your chart is really nice to look at, because then it automatically grabs people's attentions more than if it's really ugly to look at. But unfortunately, I'm mostly a programmer. I don't use fancy infographic like type tools. I started out with Matplotlib, like I think most people, and a tool that I really like because it also allows for some interactivity, and I think it's just really beautiful from like the get-go. If you input your data, is Altair, the library.
Yeah, definitely. I myself have been playing around with Plotly as well. It introduces some interactivity in your data set if you want to interact with your data sets. Let me see. We have okay, we'll take this last question, and then for the audience members who still have any other questions, please put them to Discord, and Marysia can hop on there and perhaps have some interaction over there. So the last question is, in the election graphs case, there could be a point that to avoid inducing bias, best to show both graphs.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point. I think in this case, most of the pie charts that were used to display these information were used in the context of this candidate has already had more votes, has kind of to incite the emotion or the thought that this candidate is going to win because they have like a higher percentage of the votes so far. And the second chart is more informative because it actually shows you there's so many things left still to count that the information you have so far is not very relevant to draw a conclusion on. I think the second chart actually shows you that you shouldn't be displaying any of those charts to begin with because the information is just simply not telling you anything. But yeah, you could also show both charts. It also really matters what story you tell around it. Like if you show the first graph and you really highlight this is just based on 5% of the information, that's different than if it's there in terms of information, but you say, oh, this candidate is clearly the front runner. So what you say around it also matters a lot.